Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I never intended to work in corrections. Fresh out of residency, with student loans that could have funded a small nation's healthcare system, I was looking for any position that offered decent pay and the chance to actually practice medicine. When the job posting for a prison doctor at Millfield Correctional Facility appeared on my radar, I almost scrolled past it. Prison medicine wasn't exactly what I'd envisioned when I dreamed of becoming a doctor. But the salary was competitive, the benefits were solid, and after 6 months of rejections from hospitals that wanted someone with more experience, I was running out of options. My girlfriend, Sarah, thought I was making a mistake. "You'll be dealing with criminals," she said over dinner at our tiny apartment. "Murderers, rapists, drug dealers. Is that really how you want to start your career?" I understood her concerns, but I also understood my bank account. Besides, I'd gone into medicine to help people, and inmates were still people, regardless of what they'd done. At least, that's what I told myself. Millfield Correctional was a medium security facility about an hour outside of Phoenix, housing roughly 3,200 inmates. Built in the 1980s, it had that industrial, institutional look that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Concrete walls, razor wire, guard towers that looked like they belonged in a war zone. The medical facility was a separate building within the compound, equipped with examination rooms, a small pharmacy, and a dozen beds for inmates requiring overnight observation. My supervisor was Dr. Marlene Stokes, a woman in her 50s who'd been working prison medicine for nearly 20 years. She was tough, no nonsense, and had the kind of direct manner that comes from dealing with people who lie for a living. "Rule number 1, she told me during my first day of orientation, never believe anything an inmate tells you without verification. They'll lie about symptoms to get drugs, fake injuries to avoid work detail, and claim allergies to medications they've never heard of. Rule number 2, never, and I mean never, be alone in a room with an inmate without a guard present. Rule number 3, some of these men are genuinely dangerous. Don't let empathy cloud your judgment." The orientation was thorough. Security protocols, emergency procedures, medication policies, documentation requirements. I learned about the different housing units, the various security levels, and the complex hierarchy that existed among both inmates and staff. Most importantly, I learned about the night shift. "Night duty is different," Dr. Stokes explained. "Skeleton crew, different atmosphere. The guards are more relaxed, but that can work against you. Inmates get different ideas when the sun goes down. They think differently, act differently. Some of them get philosophical." I wasn't sure what she meant by philosophical, but I'd find out soon enough. My first few weeks at Millfield were relatively uneventful. Day shifts brought a steady stream of minor injuries, chronic disease management, and the occasional emergency. I treated everything from diabetes and high blood pressure to stab wounds and overdoses. The inmates were a mixed bag. Some were respectful and cooperative, others were hostile and manipulative, and a few seemed genuinely grateful for medical attention. The guards varied too. Some were professional and courteous, treating inmates with basic human dignity while maintaining necessary boundaries. Others were bitter, viewing every inmate as a potential threat and every medical request as manipulation. A few seemed to enjoy the power they held over people who had no choice but to submit to their authority. It was Silas Romero who taught me the most about navigating the complex social dynamics of prison life. A 20-year veteran with graying temples and kind eyes, he had a way of commanding respect without resorting to intimidation. "The key," he told me during a quiet moment, "is treating them like human beings while never forgetting they're here for a reason. Most of these guys made some bad choices, but they're still people. Some of them are genuinely trying to turn their lives around. Others are just counting days until they can get back to what they were doing before." Your job is to take care of their health, not to judge them. After a month of day shifts, Dr. Stokes scheduled me for my first overnight rotation. Night shifts at the medical facility were typically quiet. One doctor, one nurse, and a guard stationed outside the building. Most of the serious medical emergencies happened during the day when inmates were active, working, and more likely to get into altercations. You'll mostly be dealing with routine calls, Dr. Stokes assured me. Headaches, stomach aches, anxiety attacks, the occasional withdrawal symptoms if someone's coming off drugs. Just remember the rules, and you'll be fine. The night shift started at 11 p.m. and ran until 7 a.m. My first overnight was a Tuesday in early November, unseasonably cool for Arizona. The medical building felt different at night, quieter, more isolated, with long shadows cast by the security lights outside. The nurse on duty was Helena Kwan, a petite woman in her 40s who'd been working prison health care for 8 years. "First night shift?" she asked as we reviewed the roster of inmates currently in medical housing. "Yeah. Anything I should know about the ones we have tonight?" She handed me the files. 3 diabetics getting blood sugar checks, 1 post-operative observation from an appendectomy yesterday, and 2 in withdrawal from opioids. Pretty standard night, hopefully. The first few hours passed without incident. I checked on each patient, reviewed medications, and caught up on some paperwork. Around 2 a.m., Helena was dozing lightly at the nurse's station while I reviewed case files in the small office adjacent to the medical ward. That's when the call came in from D block. "Medical to D block, medical to D block," the radio crackled. "We have an inmate experiencing a medical emergency." Helena was instantly alert. "What's the nature of the emergency?" she asked into her radio. "Inmate appears to be having some kind of seizure or fit, conscious but acting erratic. Guards are requesting immediate medical evaluation." I grabbed the mobile medical kit and followed Helena through the security checkpoints that separated the medical facility from the general population housing units. D block was one of the more secure sections, housing inmates with disciplinary problems or those requiring protective custody. The guard who met us at the entrance was young, maybe 25, with nervous energy that suggested he was relatively new to the job. "It's Lucero," he said, leading us down a corridor lined with cells. "Mateo Lucero, cell D47. Started acting weird about 20 minutes ago, talking to people who aren't there, claiming he can see things. We thought maybe he got hold of some drugs, but he's been in solitary for the past week." As we approached cell D47, I could hear someone talking, though I couldn't make out the words. The voice was agitated, almost frantic. "Has he had any medical issues before?" I asked the guard. "Not that I know of. Been here about 3 years, mostly keeps to himself. Never caused any major trouble until last week when he attacked his cellmate for no apparent reason. That's why he's in solitary." The cell was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a narrow bed, a toilet, and a small metal desk bolted to the wall. Mateo Lucero was sitting on the edge of his bed, rocking back and forth and speaking rapidly in a mixture of English and Spanish. He was a Hispanic man in his 30s, medium build, with numerous tattoos covering his arms and neck. "Mr. Lucero," I called through the cell bars. "I'm Dr. Navarro. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what's wrong?" He looked up at me, and I was struck by the terror in his eyes. They were wide, pupils dilated, darting around the cell like he was watching something invisible move around the room. "You can't see them?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "They're everywhere. They've been waiting for me." "See what, Mr. Lucero?" "The children," he whispered. "All the children I killed." The guard unlocked the cell and stepped inside, one hand resting on his radio. I followed, maintaining what I hoped was a safe distance while still being able to examine the patient. "Mr. Lucero, I need you to focus on me," I said, using the calm, authoritative tone I'd learned in medical school. Can you tell me if you've taken anything? Any drugs, medications, anything at all? He shook his head violently. No drugs. This is real. They're real. They want me to come with them. I checked his pupils, extremely dilated, but his pulse was rapid and his skin was clammy. The symptoms could indicate drug use, but they could also suggest a psychotic break or severe anxiety attack. Can you tell me what you're seeing exactly? Mateo looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Then he pointed to a corner of the cell, where there was nothing but concrete wall and shadow. She's standing right there, he said. Little girl, maybe 8 years old, brown hair, wearing a yellow dress. She's not saying anything, just staring at me. He paused, listening to something I couldn't hear. Now she's asking why I did it. The guard shifted uncomfortably. Doc, maybe we should get him restrained. I held up a hand. Mr. Lucero, can you tell me your full name and today's date? Mateo Lucero, November 15th, 2022. He answered correctly. But that doesn't matter. They don't care about dates. They've been waiting for me for 12 years. 12 years since what? His face crumpled and he started to cry. Since the accident. Since I killed those kids. I glanced at the guard, who looked as confused as I felt. According to the file I'd briefly reviewed, Mateo Lucero was serving time for armed robbery and assault, not vehicular homicide or any crime involving children. Mr. Lucero, I'm going to give you something to help you calm down, I said, preparing a mild sedative. Then we're going to take you to the medical facility where I can examine you properly. No, he said, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. You don't understand. I never told anyone. I never got caught for the real crime. The guard stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Mateo released my wrist and slumped back against the wall. 12 years ago I was driving drunk, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. School bus had broken down on Highway 60, just outside Tempe. Kids were waiting on the side of the road for another bus to pick them up. I felt my stomach tighten. I remembered that accident. It had been major news throughout Arizona. A drunk driver had plowed into a group of elementary school children, killing 4 and injuring 6 others. The driver had fled the scene and was never caught. I never stopped, Mateo continued. I just kept driving. Changed my license plate that night, sold the car to a chop shop in Mexico a week later, told myself it was an accident, that stopping wouldn't bring them back. The guard was staring at Mateo with a mixture of shock and disgust. I felt sick, but forced myself to remain professional. Mr. Lucero, I need you to come with me to the medical facility. We can talk more there. They know I'm dying, he said, looking back at the empty corner. The cancer. I can feel it eating me alive. They know I don't have much time left, so they're coming to collect. What cancer? Has someone diagnosed you with cancer? I haven't told anyone, but I know. The pain in my stomach, the weight loss, the blood in my stool. I've been dying for months. I made a mental note to order a full medical workup. If he was right about having cancer, it could explain some of his symptoms, though not the hallucinations. We transported Mateo to the medical facility, where I conducted a thorough examination. His vital signs were elevated, but not dangerously so. Blood work would take until morning, but his physical symptoms were concerning. Significant weight loss, pallor, and tenderness in his abdomen that suggested possible internal bleeding. The hallucinations continued throughout the night. He claimed to see 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy, standing at various points around the medical ward. He described them in detail, their names, their ages, what they were wearing when he killed them. The details matched the newspaper reports from 12 years ago with chilling accuracy. Why are you telling me this? I asked during one of our conversations. Because they want me to, he said. They say I have to confess before I die, or they'll follow me wherever I go next. Around 5 a.m., Mateo began experiencing severe abdominal pain. I ordered an emergency CT scan, which revealed a large mass in his pancreas that had likely been growing for months. The cancer was advanced, probably terminal, and had spread to his liver and lymph nodes. "How long?" he asked when I delivered the news. "Without treatment, probably weeks, maybe a month or two at most." He nodded like he'd been expecting it. They told me it would be soon. As the sun began to rise, the hallucinations seemed to fade. Mateo became calmer, more lucid, though he insisted the children were still there, just waiting more patiently now. "Doctor," he said, as I prepared to hand him over to the day shift, "I need you to do something for me." "What's that?" "I need you to contact the families of those children. Tell them what I did. Tell them I'm sorry." I stared at him. "Mr. Lucero, anything you tell me about crimes you may have committed." "I know you have to report it," he interrupted. "I want you to." I should have confessed years ago, but I was a coward. I chose to let other people suffer while I went on with my life. After my shift ended, I sat in my car in the prison parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my mind knew that Mateo was likely experiencing drug-induced hallucinations or a psychiatric breakdown brought on by his terminal diagnosis. People facing death often became consumed with guilt and regret, sometimes to the point of confessing to crimes they didn't commit. But the details he'd provided were too specific, too accurate. And there was something in his eyes, not the look of someone experiencing delusions, but the look of someone being haunted by very real memories. I drove home and spent the day researching the accident from 2010. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Mateo Lucero was telling the truth. The victims' names matched what he'd told me. The location was correct. Even small details about the weather and road conditions that night aligned with his account. When I returned for my next shift 3 days later, I learned that Mateo had died the previous night. Pancreatic cancer had progressed rapidly, and he'd experienced massive internal bleeding around 3 a.m. Helena told me his last words had been an apology to someone named Leah, the name of one of the children killed in the hit and run. I struggled with what to do with the information Mateo had given me. Legally, I was required to report any knowledge of crimes to the appropriate authorities. Morally, I felt obligated to give the victims' families some closure. But professionally, I worried about violating patient confidentiality, even after his death. After consulting with Dr. Stokes and the prison's legal department, I contacted the Phoenix Police Department and provided them with Mateo's confession. Detective Noelia Marquez, who had worked the original case, was skeptical at first. "We get false confessions to that case every few years," she told me over the phone. "Usually from people looking for attention or trying to clear their conscience of something else." But when I provided the specific details Mateo had shared, her tone changed. She agreed to investigate further, including matching Mateo's DNA to evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. The DNA was a match. Mateo Lucero had indeed been the drunk driver who killed 4 children and destroyed multiple families 12 years earlier. The case that had haunted the Phoenix Police Department for over a decade was finally closed. I attended Mateo's funeral at a small Catholic church on the south side of Phoenix. There were only a handful of people there, a few distant relatives, a prison chaplain, and me. As the priest spoke about redemption and forgiveness, I found myself thinking about the families of his victims and whether his deathbed confession would bring them any peace. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Leah Escudero's mother. Leah had been 8 years old when Mateo killed her, the same little girl he claimed to see in his cell wearing a yellow dress. "Thank you for helping him tell the truth," the letter read. "For 12 years, we didn't know who took our daughter from us. We didn't know if he felt any remorse, or if he even remembered her name. Now we know that he carried the weight of what he did, and that he was sorry. It doesn't bring Leah back, but it helps us understand that she wasn't just forgotten." The letter affected me more than I expected. I'd gone into medicine thinking that helping people meant healing their bodies, curing diseases, saving lives. I'd never considered that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is help them unburden their soul. But the experience also changed how I thought about guilt, justice, and redemption. Mateo Lucero had spent 12 years running from what he'd done, building a life on the foundation of a terrible lie. In the end, facing his own mortality had forced him to confront the truth, but only after the families of his victims had endured more than a decade of unanswered questions. Over the following months, I settled into the rhythm of prison medicine. I treated diabetes and high blood pressure, knife wounds and overdoses, broken bones and broken spirits. Each case taught me something new about human nature, about the choices people make and the consequences they live with. Some inmates were genuinely remorseful for their crimes and were working to become better people. Others showed no remorse and seemed likely to re-offend as soon as they were released. Most fell somewhere in between. Flawed human beings who had made terrible decisions but weren't entirely beyond redemption. But I never forgot Mateo Lucero or the children he claimed were waiting for him in his cell. Sometimes during quiet moments on night shifts, I would find myself wondering about the nature of guilt and whether our consciences truly can manifest physical symptoms. I'd seen enough stress-related illnesses to know that psychological trauma can absolutely cause real physical pain, but Mateo's case felt different somehow. 6 months after Mateo's death, I was working another night shift when I was called to examine an inmate who was claiming to see things that weren't there. As I walked toward the housing unit, I felt a familiar chill of recognition. The inmate was different, a white man in his 40s named Ethan Calder, serving time for embezzlement. But his symptoms were remarkably similar to Mateo's. Dilated pupils, rapid heartbeat, claims of seeing people who had died because of his actions. "They're standing right there," he insisted, pointing to an empty corner of his cell. "My business partner and his wife. The couple who lost their retirement savings because of what I stole." Unlike Mateo, Ethan Calder wasn't dying of cancer. He was perfectly healthy, physically speaking. But he'd received news the previous day that his former business partner had committed suicide after losing his home and his wife to the financial scandal Ethan had created. "I convinced them to invest their life savings in a project that didn't exist," Ethan told me as I examined him. "Told them it was guaranteed that they'd double their money in 6 months. Instead, I used their money to cover my gambling debts." The hallucinations continued throughout the night, and like Mateo, Ethan became increasingly agitated as he described the people he claimed to see. Unlike Mateo, however, Ethan survived his crisis. The visions faded as dawn approached, and he was released back to general population after a psychiatric evaluation. But the pattern was disturbing. 2 inmates, both claiming to see the spirits of people who had died because of their actions, both experiencing these visions during times of extreme stress or guilt. I started paying closer attention to similar cases, and over the next year, I encountered 3 more inmates with remarkably similar experiences. All involved crimes that had resulted in deaths the inmates hadn't been charged with. All occurred during night shifts when the prison felt most isolated from the outside world. All involved detailed specific visions that seemed to know information the inmates couldn't possibly have access to. Dr. Stokes was skeptical when I mentioned the pattern to her. "Guilt is a powerful thing," she said. "These men are locked up with nothing but time to think about what they've done. It's not surprising that some of them would develop elaborate fantasies about their victims coming back to haunt them. But the details they provide," I argued, "information they couldn't possibly know. Information they could have researched before coming to prison, or learned from other inmates, or even overheard from guards or visitors," she countered. "You're looking for supernatural explanations for psychological phenomena." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was reading too much into coincidences and stress-induced hallucinations. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening during those long night shifts at Millfield Correctional. The prison environment was unlike anywhere else I'd ever worked. The weight of accumulated guilt, anger, and despair seemed to permeate the walls themselves. On quiet nights, you could almost feel the collective burden of thousands of people living with the consequences of their worst decisions. Perhaps that environment was conducive to certain types of psychological experiences. Perhaps the isolation, the guilt, and the proximity to death created conditions where the human mind could manifest visions that felt completely real. Or perhaps there was something else at work, something that medical science couldn't easily explain or quantify. I continued working at Millfield for another 2 years before transferring to a civilian hospital. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about treating difficult patients, about working in challenging environments, and about the complex relationship between physical and mental health. But I never forgot Mateo Lucero and his confession, or the way he'd looked when he claimed to see those children in his cell. I never forgot the specific details he'd provided about an accident he'd never been charged with, or the way his symptoms had seemed to respond to factors beyond conventional medicine. Years later, working in a regular hospital emergency room, I would occasionally encounter patients experiencing guilt-related symptoms, anxiety attacks, psychosomatic pain, stress-induced illness. In those cases, I would remember Mateo and the other inmates who had been visited by the ghosts of their past actions. I learned that healing sometimes involves more than treating physical symptoms. Sometimes it means helping people face truths they've been running from, or find ways to live with consequences they can't undo. Sometimes the most important thing a doctor can do is listen when someone needs to confess, to unburden themselves of secrets that are literally making them sick. The children Mateo Lucero killed were real. The accident was real. The family's suffering was real. Whether the visions he experienced in his final days were real in any literal sense, I'll never know for certain. But I do know that guilt is a powerful force, capable of manifesting physical symptoms that can be every bit as debilitating as any disease. I know that the human mind can create experiences so vivid they become indistinguishable from reality. And I know that sometimes, facing the truth about our worst actions is the only way to find any kind of peace. Mateo Lucero died believing he was being called to account for what he'd done. Whether that calling came from his own conscience, from some supernatural force, or from the intersection of terminal illness and overwhelming guilt, I'll never be certain. What I am certain of is that his confession brought closure to families who had spent 12 years wondering why their children had died. It solved a case that had haunted investigators for more than a decade, and it taught me that healing can take many forms, even when it comes too late to save the person who needs it most. Sometimes the most important medical intervention you can provide is simply bearing witness to someone's truth, no matter how dark or painful that truth might be. Sometimes the last thing you can do for a dying patient is help them find a way to make peace with their past. Mateo Lucero's last words still haunt me, not because they were supernatural or inexplicable, but because they were so profoundly human. In his final moments, facing his own mortality, he chose to speak the truth about the worst thing he'd ever done. That choice didn't undo the harm he'd caused, but it did provide a measure of justice for his victims and their families. As a doctor, I've learned that we can't always cure what's wrong with people. Sometimes the best we can do is help them find ways to live with what's broken inside them, or in Mateo's case, to die with some measure of honesty about who they really were. The children he killed were 8, 9, 7, and 10 years old when they died. Their names were Leah Escudero, Camila Soriano, Benicio Vargas, and Anmei Liu. They had families who loved them, dreams they never got to pursue, and lives that were cut short by one man's decision to drive drunk on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2010. Mateo Lucero spent 12 years trying to forget what he'd done to them. In the end, whether through conscience, cancer, or some force beyond medical understanding, he remembered. And in remembering, he finally told the truth. That truth couldn't bring back the children or heal their family's grief, but it could provide answers, closure, and the knowledge that their children hadn't been forgotten by the man who killed them. Sometimes that has to be enough.